All right, we are live.
Live
No, that one.
in the
That one. That one.
flesh. Here we are
Yes.
in the digital flesh.
Yeah, in the digital flesh. So illicit.
Right, right.
So just for the audience in general, I've got Jeremy McKane co-hosting with me. He is an enormous advocate for the ocean, and so we've become friends. And I said, I got like, dude, everybody, like, hey, let's produce some episodes. And so he said, let's. And so we've got a great guest today. Tell us who's coming on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited because we have Fabien Cousteau. I mean, there's nothing that I can really say that would really even like tell you how cool this guy is. I mean, what's really interesting, I think, is that he was the one who actually did the Mission 31 program. That's 31
Yeah.
days living under the ocean. How cool is that? Like, I want to live under the ocean as well. But so the question is like what can we do from it? But he's an aquanaut, which is like an astronaut but under the water. And he's going to talk about this really cool thing that they do, which is like the saturation of our body to be able to stay down for a really long time. So I'm so stoked to talk about. Oh, and speak of the devil, not the devil, but there is Fabian right there.
I was just waiting to see if you could describe all these things so that I don't have to do anything.
No. I'm just like I'm as you know, I'm a fan of what you do, so I'm glad that you're on today.
Hey, Fabian, will you give us?
This is fantastic.
When we start the show, Fabian, we normally have our guests say something like, "Hey, this is Fabien Cousteau, and you're listening to the Break It Down show." And if you want to do it en français, that's fine as well.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Fabien Cousteau, and today we are on the Break It Down show.
Je m'appelle Pete. Le tourne le robinet à chaud et à froid. Yeah, that's my French. Hey, yeah, so we got Jeremy McKane on, and it's great to have you here, Fabien. We were already talking about things, so I'm going to shut up and get out of the way and let Jeremy do some of the asking.
Cool. Well, everyone, thank you for joining the show, and Pete, thanks for having me and Fabian on the show, which is always. It's cool to watch your show, but it's even cooler to be on your show. So thank you. So here we Fabian, like I just you've got so many really cool things that you're working on. I think maybe could you give us a little bit of history of everyone you're referred to as an aquanaut. Like could you give us an idea or give the audience an idea of what an aquanaut is and really how you got your start in all this?
Well, Jeremy, I think you hit it right on the head, right? I mean, an aquanaut is essentially an astronaut underwater. And although most people think of going into the ocean as a scuba diver or a snorkeler or free diver or what have you, an aquanaut is essentially a saturated scuba diver. And by that, I mean that when you learn to scuba dive for the first time, you actually, funny that I mentioned this because I have some dive tables right in front of me here, not for this show, but for some work that we're doing. And you learn from these dive tables as a recreational scuba diver to avoid what's called decompression obligations. And so the benchmark rules were essentially you could go down to 60 feet for 60 minutes or some variation thereof to avoid decompression obligations. And decompression is simply a term that you use for those who go down and stay down for a certain amount of time. When you come back up, in order for the nitrogen bubbles, that's part of the air that you breathe, not to become big in your circulatory system, you go up slowly and you go up in stages, right, into certain levels. When you're a scuba diver, recreational scuba diver, you avoid that by going by these dive tables. And if you don't, nitrogen has a tendency to bond or to get together into bigger bubbles, a little bit like when you shake a Coke or a soda bottle up and you open it up. And that's something you don't want to have happen in your system. Now, when you're a saturated diver, and that could be a commercial diver, that could be a lot of things, you have to do these extensive decompression stops. And that could be, it depends on what your parameters are, but essentially you're stopping at certain levels in the ocean so that you have time, or your body has time to eject the nitrogen out of your system in a safe fashion. When you're an aquanaut, you maximize those decompression obligations. Right. So all of a sudden you go from recreational to the other side of the world. And there are some very real serious repercussions from that if you don't abide by the rules and regulations. So let's say you saturate at 60 feet. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you're down there for more than a day. Then your decompression obligations in order to come back to the surface safely is about 24 hours. And it's actually 18 and a half hours, but by the time you prep, by the time you exit, in this case, a habitat, your decompression obligations take about 24 hours or so, maybe a little bit less. And one of the safety things that we do as aquanauts is you get on and off oxygen to purge that nitrogen sooner out of your system.
Right. So it's interesting because I think that's the one thing as a recreational diver you're always worried about. You're worried about not going up too fast. Like for those of us that dive, we're very aware of these things. I remember about a year and a half ago, I had done basically a drift dive, and the tide was coming in. It was going to be kind of a fun thing, and this was moving pretty quickly. I think they clocked it in at 8 knots. That's how fast the tide was kind of moving in, and it felt like 100 miles an hour. But very quickly, my computer is beeping at me because I'm going up too fast. I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do here? And the panic thing is a real thing in a situation like that, because it's like you really don't have control over it. And so you think about all those things kind of going up. I would think, and in that scenario, like every bit of training that you have as a recreational diver, it's like, I remember when I first started doing it back in 1997. You've probably been doing it longer, but my instructor at the time said, Jeremy, he goes, a good rule of thumb is you don't go up any faster than the tiniest bubble that you can see from, that's obviously your from your bubbles. You'll see like these little bubbles, and just don't go any faster than those. That's a good rule of thumb, but just try to stay down as long as you can as you're coming up. Well, what I would think about, like on a saturated dive, I mean, how do you guys I guess alternate to get to a point where it is safe to come back up after you've been down? So if you're down for say a day versus 31 days, like in your case, like you did, is there a longer period of time that you have to kind of acclimate to get back up? How does that process even work?
Well, so first I'd like to precursor that by saying that by and large, scuba diving is a very safe recreational activity if you follow the basic rules. Right. There's a lot of built-in safety in these dive tables and everything else. So although panicking is certainly the worst thing you can do underwater, a lot of people do it, especially in the scenario you're mentioning, because there's no way you can fight an 8-knot current or even a 2-knot current. I mean, it's
breathe out a lot.
Yeah, and so you have to be careful with these things, of course, and try not to get yourself in those scenarios. But essentially, a recreational diver is a no decompression diver, right? So in theory, you can go to the surface following your bubbles, not faster than your bubbles, relatively safely to the surface. There's something built in also as an additional safety, which is a safety stop. Or you stay for 3 minutes at 15 feet or so, just so you can hedge your bets, right?
Yeah.
But by and large, all of that is all just additional safeties, so that as a recreational scuba diver, you get to enjoy yourself and you don't have to get yourself in a bad scenario. As a saturated diver, you're flipping everything upside down, right? And you're maximizing your decompression obligations. And within that context, you might as well be on the far side of the moon. You cannot go to the surface. Even at 60 feet, saturated at 60 feet or 3 atmospheres of pressure, you're basically, if you go to the surface in a panic and you don't have a decompression chamber at the surface, within 15 minutes, you're going to exhibit, minor signs of, things like paralysis and death. So these are things you kind of want to avoid. And like I said, you might as well be on the far side of the moon. And if you're a saturation diver at the bottom, regardless of whatever depth you're at, you are relegated to whatever means necessary to decompress from that spot or from an area within there to the surface. And to answer your question, it doesn't matter whether you're 60 feet or 600 feet, because there's a maximum saturation level at those various pressures. And at 60 feet, whether you're there for a day or 31 days, you've maximized your decompression obligations. Your body has acclimated to those pressures. The flip side of the coin, so you have to do your 24-hour deco stop or 18.5-hour deco stop. But the flip side of the coin is that gives you something absolutely invaluable, which is something that's always frustrated me as a scuba diver, which is your limit of time, right? That's 60 feet for 60 minutes. So you're scrambling to get things done. Or if you're on a recreational dive, it gives you just enough time to start enjoying yourself. And all of a sudden you have to go to the surface, which is really frustrating.
It's horrible. It is.
And as a saturation diver now, all of a sudden you have unprecedented access to the bottom world. And for us during Mission 31, we were able to stay at 60 feet or 70 feet for indefinite periods of time. And that means that all of a sudden our 1-hour dives or 45-minute dives become 2, 3, 4, 5-hour dives. And the only reason we're going back is because we're cold, we're tired, we're hungry, we need to go to the bathroom. And so we go back to the habitat. But it gives you the luxury of time that allows for much more extensive science, much more extensive filmmaking, and just the general enjoyment of being in that underwater jungle, that underwater city.
I want to ask about the.
Go ahead.
I want to ask about the progression of this tech, because we've had Herbert Nitsch on the show. I don't know if you know him. He's a free diver.
Yeah. He's a champion free diver. Sure.
Yeah, 837 feet.
Yeah,
that's like a World War II submarine. But he's had to develop and invent his own things, his own kind of goggles. If I remember correctly, he snorts salt water into his sinus cavity to keep it from. It's incredible. And then he decompresses on the web. He calls it taking little naps. It's bonkers to do that. But he had incrementally work on these problems. Yeah. And this is for the audience. You guys probably know this, but the pressure is so great. I think it's his spleen acts like a third lung, and the oxygenated blood that normally doesn't get out of there gets crushed out and then sends a blast of oxygen. It's insane. So as you guys are figuring these things out that sound insane as you describe them, how do you test it? Do you do it on, a lab animal? Do you just say, we think this will work and go for it, like Evel Knievel style? Like, how do you make these leaps to understand? Because you're pioneering stuff all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question and a very, very specific one. So depending on what organization you are, right? I mean, a Herbert Nitsch or a Fabien Cousteau, we're in the public world. We're not commercial. We're not Navy. So we are doing things based off of what's happened, the information and the knowledge that's passed down from generation to generation. And of course, we're pushing the limits within safety parameters, a little bit at a time. And, Herbert probably got down to the 800-foot mark and beyond incrementally. Right. And that's basically how we're doing things, because you learn things with each step, and then you learn where your parameters are and where your limitations are. In the military parameters, we don't know. We kind of know, but it's classified. So, I mean, the stuff that they're doing, of course, is very advanced as well, but their parameters with pushing the limits can be very different. And so, and I'm being very careful with this because I don't want to be blacklisted from working with the navies of the world. But it's they're doing some very extreme things for very different reasons. What we're doing it for is for science and for research on things like biochem compositions of deep water sponges, things like that. And so the necessity for going deeper and longer and further is driven by a different kind of knowledge set than it would be for, say, a military application or even a commercial application.
So you touched a little bit on this before. Why? This is going to be my interest, and I think maybe the audience as well. Is like, there might be some people watching now thinking like, yeah, okay, you can do it, but why bother? So could you tell us maybe a little bit about maybe your upcoming project and why it's important to go to the bottom for such a long period of time as you would define?
Well, it's comfortable not to go outside your box, right? It's comfortable to sit on a couch and watch TV and all that, and we all love doing that. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't be a good explorer if I were to ask why rather than why not. And that's really important, because for us as a society to be able to better ourselves, to be able to advance, to be able to go to the next step in evolution, we need to be able to keep pushing those boundaries of knowledge beyond sometimes the comfort zones, and certainly beyond our current parameters, so that we understand where we stand, how we can better address the challenges that we face today, and get a better sense of, in this particular case, our ecosystem, our life support system, which is the ocean. This is an oasis in space, and the thing that sustains all life that we know is the ocean, is water. It helps generate it generates every other breath that we take, and it's much more complicated than that. But basically, the ocean provides for us every other breath that we take. So imagine if you take that away, if we didn't know that. And in many ways, we're acting as if that didn't matter, because we're treating our oceans as an endless resource in a garbage can. And there are a lot of very real repercussions that we read in the newspapers every day, including the fact that when you go to a supermarket or restaurant, you're playing Russian roulette. You're taking your chances that about 50% of those that sea life that you're eating is now full of microplastics, because we've been dumping it into our ocean world. And so all of those things are fundamental knowledge that we need to better understand, so that we as individuals, whether we're aquanauts or not, whether we're even scuba divers, or even care, or even have seen the ocean or not, understand that fundamental interrelationship and make better decisions in our everyday lives as much as we can. Because cumulatively, that makes an enormous impact. Taking the plastics issue, for example, and COVID is certainly affecting this, but essentially, each and every one of us in North America is using, on average, 8 single-use pieces of plastic in our everyday lives.
Jesus.
A vast majority of that goes into the ocean. That's over 300 million pounds per year in our ocean every year. And so it's alarming when you hear these words. But how easily can we address this is actually fairly simple. Imagine if each and every one of us eliminated 1 to 2 or more single-use plastics in our everyday lives. Things that we really don't need, wrappers and plastic bags and all this stuff that we discard without thinking about it. There's no throwing things away. That's something that we have to start registering, is the convenience of throwing away. There's no way. This is a closed loop system. So, it affects our lives in very fundamental ways. Whether we love the ocean or not, whether we have seen the ocean or not, our actions are impacting our health. And so to be able to understand this in maybe more concrete ways, and doing that research is of fundamental importance. Beyond this, things like deep water sponges are now giving us chemical compositions to combat leukemia and other cancers. Cone snail poison, venom, is now being synthesized to combat or to be a pain mitigator. So there's now a treatment that from the cone snail venom that is 1,000 times more potent than morphine without the side effects. So imagine that boom to the medical world. And that's just one aspect of the things that we can, or two aspects of the things that we can really stand to benefit from pushing those boundaries to go longer, deeper, and further, and to really get down to that final frontier and do all that scientific research in a very efficient way.
Yeah, and I think those things are really fascinating because it's like, we don't know what we don't know, and I think that's really the other really exciting thing about what you're doing. I mean, it's been said that we know more about space than we do our own oceans, and a lot of that is because in some ways it's a lot easier to get to space than it is the deep ocean. But you have a really amazing project called Proteus, and
Yes.
and I would love to learn. I'd say I would love to learn. You and I have talked about this in great lengths. There's always something for me to learn, but I think it'd be really great for the audience here to kind of really understand kind of this next evolution of what you're working on. And I'd be curious to also have you share what your vision is for that project.
Yeah. So Proteus is a very ambitious and interesting project. I've been called crazy. I've been told it was
We're all crazy.
impossible. Yeah, I mean, that stuff just, I mean, for people like us, that just drives me to want to do it more and prove them wrong. And by and large, where there's a will, there's a way, and nothing is impossible. I wish that word would be stricken from the dictionary because it's an excuse not to do things.
Well, that's how I got married, to be honest with you. It worked out.
Well, and Waylon Jennings says, I've always been crazy, but it kept me from going insane.
Yes.
There you go.
So there's that.
There you go.
And that's a perfect saying. I mean, the Proteus, I just realized I have notes behind me from that project, but Proteus is essentially building on some very real concrete fundamentals that have been proven possible by the advent of underwater habitats that started with Conch Shelf 1. And I'm distinguishing habitat from shelter.
Okay.
And if you want, I could go into those details. But an underwater habitat is essentially a house underwater combined with a workspace underwater. So it's a life support system that provides that you can eat, sleep, live in, and of course be based out of. And it provides a working space that you can bring back your samples or the information that you've acquired wandering outside that habitat into the ocean column, and work on it from a dry environment, but suitable to that pressure depth. Essentially, it's an underwater laboratory, if you will. And it's very distinct from other tools that we have, like submarines, like ROVs, probes, etc. Of course, diving from the surface from a boat, in that it allows the residents of that habitat to acclimate to the local pressure and to be able to wander out into that water column on a unlimited or fairly unlimited basis. And that's very different from a submarine. A submarine, right, or an ROV, for example, allows you to go to great depths, but you're there for a limited, finite amount of time. Same thing with scuba diving, same thing with a lot of other things. So it allows the scientist or the explorer or the researcher to go out there in that final frontier and do their work for as long as they need to go to do it, and then come back to a dry, unpressurized environment or locally pressurized environment to do the research. And it for mission 31, which is when I spent 31 days at the bottom of the sea in Aquarius, with my team, we were able to do 10 to 12 hours of diving a day each until we got exhausted. And that cumulative effect of research allowed us to do over 3 years worth of scientific experiment in that 31 days. So there's a coefficient of time that's invaluable. Proteus sits on the foundation of the conch shelves and the hydrolabs and sea labs and all those other habitats that have existed in the past, and builds on their strengths and builds out the things that they all wish they had the opportunity to do with today's modern technology and ability to stay longer and to provide for a larger space that allows for a bigger team. And that provides an opportunity for much more extensive research.
Yeah, and when you're down there, I mean, because you mentioned it both in the submarine and as a scuba diver. I mean, it's no time is ever enough. It seems to be for me, because it feels like the second that I'm down, it's like I already have to start thinking about coming back up. And what are some of the things like with Mission 31 that you were able to kind of understand about the undersea world that you hope to kind of extend greater knowledge through Proteus?
Well, we've explored less than 5% of our ocean world to date. And if you take the ocean as a living space, all 3.4 billion cubic kilometers of volume, and compare it to land-based living space, the ocean represents about 99% of our world's living space. So there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah.
Logically, as we look at trying to find new resources for our needs, looking at counterbalancing our impact with our planet, with the need to shepherd and protect our planet, we have a great need to build something, or maybe a series of underwater habitats, to complement the other technologies that are out there that are doing some fantastic work, be it gliders, or be it submarines, or what have you. This provides something I feel that can not only complement that research with those vehicles, but also provide things that are very unique to a habitat. And that's the human contact, the human element within that alien world.
Yeah.
A submarine is like an airplane or a bus, right? You're cruising through a medium, and you're looking out the window, checking things out, and potentially grabbing a few samples on the way. But essentially, you're segregated from the environment. Being an aquanaut, you are immersed in the environment. It's essentially, in its most basic definition, it's the International Space Station underwater, right? And you're going for spacewalks.
Yeah.
And that's invaluable. And one of the reasons why NASA and other space agencies are looking at doing something around the moon, building a space station around the moon, or putting eventually colonies in Europa and Mars and even the moon, because we stand to learn a lot from those things. Yet we have an inner space here that's we've barely scratched the surface of, and we could stand to learn a lot from doing the same things underwater. And actually, it's a great anecdote for space exploration to be able to do that.
Oh, for sure it is, 1,000%. And I think it's interesting too, because it's like you mentioned that human contact, and I think that's so important. And several years ago, I was actually kind of, I mean, as a kid, I always wanted to be a marine biologist, and I ended up being a tech guy and an artist, and trying to put those two things together. And along the way, I got asked by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to come along and do some general health assessments with humpback whales. And so it's, my friend Ashley Baxter, who works with me, we're on this boat and we're tooting along, and we're basically kind of just analyzing these amazing creatures, and I happened to notice that there was always this tension, because we were working in Maui, and they basically told me, they said, well, it's basically governed by two different entities, and you can't really get in the water, so we have to do it a different way. So I just kind of followed their lead. I was actually brought on to kind of just share the story of what the scientists were and convey it in an artistic form. And I remember distinctly, there was one period where there was this beautiful, there was a male and female humpback, and they were just kind of just being so, just almost like a dance underwater. I have to see if I can find that footage and send it to you one day. And the way that I was filming it was, I had my hand underneath the water, and at the time I had gotten permission from the federal government, but not the local government. So I figured, well, that means I could put half my body in the water, I guess. I don't know. But they were also filming with a pole, and I remember thinking to myself, it just seems like we're doing it the hard way. And without me even saying anything to Ashley, she kind of piped up, and she went to one of the scientists, and she's like, well, how long have you been at NOAA working on this project? She's like, well, I've been here for about 12 years or so. And And she was like, you guys must get in the water all the time with these animals. And she's like, no, we don't actually. We don't ever. She goes, I've never been in the water with them.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of an awkward silence there. And then her response next was probably one that I'll never forget. She says, well, I don't understand. Like, your job as a scientist is to really understand these animals. How can you understand without making that emotional connection with them and being in there in that same space? And she said, well, it's just simply not what we do. And it's not because it was anything other than that's not the protocol. And I remember thinking in that moment, I thought, well, if I really want to know these animals, I need to go get in the water with them, and I need to go do it in a way. And so I've since done that several times. But the thing is I think what you hit on is such a really important part. It's because, we can study these things from a distance. And I do think that ROVs and submarines definitely have their place. But then there becomes that emotional connection of what we really understand. And I think, don't you have a story about a grouper that used to kind of visit that area? Could you maybe tell us a little bit of what you guys were able to glean just by being underwater for an extended period of time?
Sure, absolutely. And you know better than anyone. I mean, you and I are tech weenies. You've invented some pretty awesome
Guilty.
stuff. But and I love technology. If used properly, absolutely, without a doubt, that helps us further our causes. But the human element, which is what you're talking about, is what makes us up and what makes us unique. And that interaction, that human interaction with what the subject matter is fundamentally important for us to better understand. And what you highlighted in your story about not being able to get in the water and having to use a pole cam is so archaic. And I'm all for rules and regulations. They're absolutely very well intentioned. And protocol sometimes, unfortunately, gets in the way by certain agencies to really further our understanding of that connection between human beings and our web of life, which is fundamentally important for us to further our society. But that said, I'm not encouraging people to just break laws and jump in.
Absolutely
they're
not.
there for a reason. Yes. But in that same scenario you were talking about before I go to the Goliath Grouper is we, during the PBS series called Jean-Michel Cousteau Ocean Adventures, Jean-Michel Cousteau is my father, we went to the Humpback National Marine Sanctuary in Maui, and we were able to weed our way with great difficulty through that protocol, and we were able to get down into the water with rebreathers and film the humpbacks mating. And there's no substitute for that when you're telling a story to an average person who's not a scientist. For them to connect with those animals, you have to be able to show that tactile nature. But you have to do it in a way that is respectful to the animals, respectful to the laws, of course, and has a message that is valid. Now, for your Goliath Grouper entertainment,
yes,
during Mission 31, man, I had a great time. I'm probably a nutball because the saddest moment I ever had during Mission 31 was on the 31st day when we had to go back to the surface. That was probably the saddest moment I've ever had in my life, having to give up that habitat and that luxury of being at the bottom with my new friends in the coral reef, to go back up to the surface, which arguably, when you pierce that blue veneer back in reverse, you go from a fireworks display of life and action and soap opera to relative emptiness, really. It was crazy, the shock that I had coming back up. When we were down there, one of the residents of around the habitat was a Goliath grouper that we named Sylvia, after Dr. Sylvia Earle, one of our family friends and an amazing champion of the ocean. You know her very well. And there was another one by the name of Jacques Cousteau, who was kind of a bigger, older male grouper. He would show up every once in a while, but Sylvia was a resident underneath the habitat, and so we had a chance to see her every time we were in and out. And she was at first very shy, and then eventually she let us get closer. But what's cool about Goliath grouper, they're a highly endangered species, by the way, that only really are found in any number in the Florida region because they're protected there for now. And I say for now, with unfortunately some some sadness because people are trying to start hunting them again.
No.
These animals are like big puppy dogs. It's not even a challenge. So,
Right.
you know, to fish them is just silly. You know, but whatever. The point is that we got to hang out with Sylvia a few times, and she would let you know when you got a little too close, just like a lot of Goliath groupers. The Goliath grouper boom, or bark, if you will, is a shockwave so powerful that if you're really close, you can feel it. It feels like someone punched you really hard in the chest, and you feel it in your air cavities, which are your lungs. And there's, I remember we were filming slow motion, a boom of, I think it was Sylvia. And if you do that with a camera that's slow, that does enough frames per second slow motion, you can see a cavitation bubble that is hotter than the surface of the sun for just a split second. It is amazing how powerful that shockwave is, and that's what stuns their prey before they slurp them up. Right. It's a pretty phenomenal thing. But Sylvia was really a pretty cool Goliath grouper, and like I said, big puppy dog. I mean, we got close enough to touch her. Obviously, we didn't, but we have some pictures of one of my aquanauts, Liz, just hanging out, you know, face to face, watching each other, observing each other, and it was just really cool. And she let us watch her, you know, predator prey behavior and all sorts of other stuff.
See, and that's the exact kind of thing that, you know, you're not going to be able to see in just a brief jaunt underneath the water, and that leads to that human understanding. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, the deep sea is, and even, this is really even not that deep, you know, considering, but that is the final frontier, I think, as it goes from human knowledge. I mean, it's like, you know, I always think of Star Trek, and it's like, you know, you think of the opening lines of Star Trek talking about, you know, space, the final frontier, and it's like the ocean is the final frontier, you know. And I think we have so much to learn about these things, and you know, I'm constantly just in awe at the stuff that kind of comes back. I mean, some of the reasons too that I know that Proteus is potentially a thing that many people will look at. I think there's also kind of like you touched on it a little bit, but there's kind of like a medical benefit as well of the things that we learn, the things that we'll understand, and you know how that can help us kind of you know change the way that the pharmaceutical world looks at things. I think that's another really amazing thing that you guys are doing. Maybe switch gears just for a minute. You know, a couple years ago at IUCN, I had the pleasure to meet former President Anote Tong of Kiribati, and he was saying because of rising tides, rising oceans, we're about to lose our land. So Kiribati, Tuvalu, Maldives, those were some of the countries that were facing, you know, because like Maldives, for instance, I think their maximum height was like at 6 feet. Is it 6 feet? So I'm curious, with this technology, I think the other thing that would be interesting is that, you know, could we potentially be looking at a future where we have colonies or civilizations of people living underwater? And if so, is that super far in the future, or is it relatively close? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's the fantasy aspect of that and the reality aspect of that. Technologically, we either have the technology, we can develop the technology, we have the knowledge to develop the adaptations and the technologies to be able to do that. Physiologically and psychologically, there are certainly parameters within which that may or may not be feasible. For example, if you're claustrophobic, you don't want to be in a habitat like Aquarius. I mean, it's 500 square feet. You've got 6 people in it. You know, it's a nice cozy space, or as I'd like to call it, it's like a New York City studio apartment when you first move in with your bunkmates. But feasibly, can you do it? Sure. I mean, there's already a couple of hotels that have a one atmosphere that have basically rooms underwater. They're just under the surface, so you don't have to deal with decompression stuff. But you know, decompression is called caisson's disease for a reason. And I don't know if you know the history of that when they were building the Brooklyn Bridge and all that.
Yeah.
Essentially, the workers were getting decompression sickness when they were working on the stanchions because they were going down to the bottom of the Hudson the caisson around it was allowing them to go in a dry environment, but you still have those pressures, and they would get decompression. No one knew what that was at the time.
Okay.
You're going to have to deal with parameters like that, and eventually we don't know what. Well, I think we have a good idea of what long term, years of being at those pressures might do to our physiology. But more specifically, I think it's impractical to think that we would have large colonies all over the world. Can we do it? Sure, with enough money and enough willpower, you could build colonies in different places. Can you live there permanently? I think for emotional reasons, we're now terrestrial creatures. We would miss the sun, we would miss the birds, we miss all that stuff for a lot of us. Personally, I would trade it up, no problem. But I'm a weird person. I think most people would probably still enjoy being up on in a regular air environment. And then physiologically, there are limitations, and there are aspects that could be real problems. For example, there are a lot of side effects, temporary side effects, when you're at multiple atmospheres of pressure. Infections go rampant much more quickly, so you have to address them much more quickly.
Wow.
On the other hand, hair and bruises heal much more quickly. Hair grows faster because of the enriched oxygen environment. You lose a lot of your sense of taste and smell. Thankfully, in the case of because you're six people for a month together,
right?
You can imagine what I'm talking about, and the fact that you have to eat astronaut food essentially, because that multiple atmospheres cooking is impractical. You cannot have open flame, so you have to do it with a microwave or hot water that you heat up from the surface and pump down. So there are a lot of these kinds of issues that you'd have to work out if it's for long-term deployment. But technologically speaking, there's certainly aspects of that would be very interesting, whether it's actually for colonies under the water or colonies in space, or even just on land, to be able to be more efficient and lower our energy needs, lower our consumption rates, lower our pollution rates. We can certainly work on those things from underwater colonies, because now you're talking about a miniature closed loop system that you can apply to a global closed loop system.
Yeah.
I have a question about the access that you guys have created with this. Surely other scientists have other questions that aren't germane to, grouper or whatever. I mean, I can imagine an anthropologist or an archaeologist are desperate to get down because, they've not studied any of this, and there's has to be history for them to look at and to learn from.
That's a great point. I mean, those are aspects and disciplines that could greatly benefit from being on site for extended periods of time. Ask any archaeologist, if you could park a house near where they're excavating. I mean, their excavation sometimes takes years and years and years, decades. That would be so much more practical than having to travel there every time and then going back at night and so on and so forth. So absolutely, without a doubt, those are disciplines that could greatly stand to benefit. Jeremy, you were talking about pharmaceuticals earlier. The biochem industry and all that, of course, could benefit from that. The engineering, I would imagine, if you're building autonomous robots and things like that, you're putting them in an extreme environment. You can address any kind of issues it may have right there on site. You can fix the thing in the field. You could bring it back to the habitat, and redeploy it. Probes and ROVs and all that, you can send them out, and retrieve them without having to go to a boat and then going back to land and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be done there, and you can develop all those things on site if you have the right laboratories and the right space to do it.
Yeah, the thing, with the projects and stuff that we're doing out in the field, like, from a technological standpoint, the general consensus is that 50% of everything that we put out in the field will break. And so it's your job to try to fix it as quickly as possible. And if you have to go back on land, go back to the drawing board. In Texas, there's an old saying that I've heard growing up, saying, "Man plans, God laughs," which means essentially, it doesn't matter what I come up with in concept over here. I could come up with every kind of software routine, hardware. I could fill the whole thing with wax. Somehow, somewhere, something's going to get corroded. Something's going to break. And but having access to, I like how you mentioned having a house next to the
Yeah.
excavation site, because that makes perfect sense. I mean, the less time that you're traveling, I think, is really important. Well, I know Pete, we're probably running a little bit out of time, but I did want to talk to you a little bit about your nonprofit that you started in 2016. It's the Ocean Learning Center that you created, and the mission is to protect preserving the ocean and marine habitats. I'm curious about. I'm always curious about impact. I'm always asking, like, okay, well, what can we do? Measurable impact. And I know that you've done some really amazing things. So, what are some of the ways that your organization has made an impact that you're really proud to talk about?
Sure. I'm really proud at the managers and the volunteers, and they've done such an amazing job. I can only say that maybe I was an impresario in that endeavor. I mean, they are really doing all the hard work. But before I get on that, if your success rate is 50%, you're doing extremely well. I want to be on your team.
Seriously.
I mean, salt water is an extreme environment. It's brutal, man.
It is an extreme environment. Well, I mean, but things break. I mean, they
Yeah.
constantly break, and it's like, 50%. It's also kind of like, I kind of just pulled that out of my hat, because it's also kind of like the Anchorman. 60% of the time, it works every time. I mean,
That's right.
every little piece that I think I've tried, and I just, in my head, I've consumed this concept of, like, this is gonna work. There's no possible way. Well, they also thought that about the Titanic, and look how that
Yeah.
ended. But I think what's really great about it is when you're continually failing in some of these ways, you're really fine tuning the technology, because at some point you get to a really solid state kind of system, and you can really potentially kind of like really push it out there. And I mean, I know that's what you're doing. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make something really simple.
Yeah, I
But yeah,
mean,
no, it's just the way it is. That's why we want to do things in the field, and I think that's why having a project like Proteus is really important.
well, and that, and the Ocean Learning Center, it has for focus exactly that, what you're talking about, which is, we're following the old mantra that my grandfather used to say, which is, people protect what they love what they understand, and they understand what they're taught. And in today's world, you have to be able to speak a modern language that invites young at heart to participate in all this solution building. And so, some of the programs are, couple women empowerment with sea turtle restoration, or in the case of the coral reef restoration project that we're going to have in Curacao, if COVID allows, in the fall of this year, we're coupling 3D printing technology with coral reef restoration. And we're inviting volunteers to design a coral or the coral structure through 3D printing, and we're using calcium carbonate and organic materials that belong in the ocean to literally create coral, and to have, mixed in with science to allow the zooxanthellae, the polyps, to or the gametes actually, to settle on that structure. And then we install those structures in the coral reef itself, so that we can participate in that coral reef restoration. It's an excellent vehicle for sneaking science in through the back door, all while having fun with technology. And that I think caters to a much larger demographic than those who want to be marine biologists. And I think kids are really excited about that. Being able to offer something that belongs in the ocean, and gives some tangible benefit to the local coral reef ecosystem, is of course part of the goal. But the real part is to engage people and to really empower them to become part of the solution, and to become more knowledgeable, and to become, at the end of the day, um, spokespeople, to be able to influence their networks.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's so cool is we're at this really interesting part in time. Like, the things that we know now, as Sylvie would say, we didn't know a long time ago. We do know we can act, we can do these amazing things, but we also kind of are now at this new pinnacle where we have technology at our hands that allows us to do some really amazing things. I mean, we've got, you can pretty much go to Target and pick up a small little microcomputer called a Raspberry Pi. Yeah, or you can just have your phone. This is actually a quantitative time. I mean, there's just so many more times more powerful than the missions to the moon on the Apollo missions. And it's like, if you think what they essentially had a calculator. And they had people on the ground manually doing math to try to transmit what needed to be done. We're so far beyond that. And what's amazing is we are now at a point where I think we can really start to kind of understand this environment. And I think when we start to no longer separate us from the undersea world, I think ultimately will help. I think it will help longevity. I think it will give us the opportunity. The only thing that I worry about, and I know that you think about this too, is that I think that exploration should not be used for exploitation of the oceans. And one of the things that that I'm very passionate about right now is hopefully trying to find a way to put a moratorium on deep sea mining, because as we talked about these little gadgets, well, they need these rare earth minerals. Yep. And we've got these manganese nodules that have existed on the seafloor for hundreds of millions of years, and it's the least likely ecosystem to change, or adapt to change, rather. So, it's just stuff like that I think is really interesting. And I think as we become wiser and we're better connected, I think we'll have some of the things. I think the other thing that's really interesting about what you're doing, both on the nonprofit side and potentially with Proteus, is that it was Captain Paul Watson, I think, said the most dangerous thing or most effective thing that you can have is a camera. And when we actually look at that amazing stuff that's happening, and just even that interaction that you had with Sylvia the grouper underwater, and people start to see that, they feel that, they become emotionally connected to it, and then that very well nicely dovetails what your grandfather said about loving the ocean and loving and protecting. So for me, I'm fascinated with all of this, because I see this as the tipping point, and I see you right on the front of this tipping point, where as we start to kind of get our toes wet, so to speak. I was going to try not to use a lot of puns today, but we're just getting started. And I would think, with the work that you're doing with OLC and Proteus, it's very possible that the kids today could be just as excited about ocean exploration as kids in the 1960s were about space and going to the moon. And to me, that is probably one of the most exciting things that I think we have to look forward to.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I love that you mentioned the Raspberry Pi, for example. That was our controller for our 20,000 frame a second camera underwater.
No way.
Called the Edgertronic Pro, and we had the only two prototypes at that point. And thanks to Grace Young from MIT, we were able to test them in an extreme environment. And the Raspberry Pi was the interface. With technology now, as opposed to a couple of decades ago, you can't get away with anything anymore. And with cameras everywhere, if you're lying, cheating, stealing from the ocean or from anywhere, you stand a very good chance at getting called out. And so there's a very real need, of course, to monitor what's going on in our ocean. And as we go and push the boundaries, you're right. I mean, these things do use all sorts of rare materials that are sometimes available or are now starting to be found at the bottom of the sea. How do we control that, or how do we navigate our way to catering to the needs or the demands of the world, all while doing things in a proper way that doesn't mimic what we did on land? And that requires a lot of discipline, that requires a lot of knowledge, and that requires us to follow protocols and rules so that we can stop living on this planet and start living with this planet, so that we do have a long-term future.
Very well said. I think,
Yeah.
I think the ancient Hawaiians had it right. I mean, they had figured out a way to be self-sustainable for millions of people. But there was always this concept throughout all of Polynesia about giving back and not just taking. And
It's a
I
bank
think we've
account. It's a
gotten
natural resource bank account.
Yeah.
We're eating away what's left of the capital rather than living off the interest that it bears. And at this
Yeah.
point, we need to put back into the capital.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we can't expect unlimited economic growth with limited natural resources. It's just not possible. Amazing. Well, I think all the stuff that you're working on is super cool. And I had said to you before, I was like, had I known that this whole COVID quarantine thing was going to happen, I would be like, we need to accelerate Proteus immediately, so I could just spend my quarantine time at the bottom of the ocean.
You can do research on COVID down there. It's funny that we keep going back to COVID, but COVID is now affecting marine mammals. I don't know if you read that article.
I know.
Crazy.
Yeah. And at the same time, I have to say that scuba diving is the best social distancing.
Yes.
Yes, it is. It beats a walk in the park for sure.
I love it.
I don't know if it looks like we've been almost on for an hour. I just enjoyed this conversation so much. Pete, your show is amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thanks,
for
man.
having us on.
We didn't even hear. We talked over Pete. So
I know we did. I know. I
Pete.
feel horrible.
Couple great questions though.
Hey, you know what? I learned from Vin Scully. I mostly try to shut up when good people are talking. I let you guys do the lifting, so I get to talk plenty on my own show. Trust me.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for having us on your show. And Jeremy, always a pleasure. I can't wait to do this again someday. In the meantime, I hope you all stay safe and happy, and enjoy life, all while respecting life.
Fair enough.
Yes.
I'm going to push
Well
stop
said.
on this thing. Here we go.